And he commanded the crowd, recline on the ground, and they were satisfied. Consider two people who strove to restore order and truth and goodness in the church of the 15th century, namely St. Joan of Arc and Jerome Savonarola. They were both unjustly condemned to death and burned at the stake. Although saints like Philip Neri considered Savonarola a great man, he is not canonized, whereas St. Joan is. One reason is surely that St. Joan always worked with and submitted to authority, even when those in the position of authority put her to death. Savonarola, however, worked against the authority of the wicked Borgia Pope Alexander VI, disobeying direct orders that he should have obeyed, as well as preaching openly against him. St. Joan was called by God through St. Michael, but was approved by God's church only after a thorough examination by those in positions of authority. Once approved, she was then promoted to her place as general of the French army by Charles, the Crown Prince of France. Now, St. Joan always worked according to God's established order. Savonarola did not take this path, but instead became a sort of cult of personality and schemed with princes to remove the Pope from office as an illegitimate pontiff, claiming that he had bought the office. Now, clearly, God was not behind this maneuver because nothing came of it. To this very day, we consider Alexander VI a legitimate pope. As much as we may admire the bravado and efforts of a Savonarola in such a trying moment of history, God has not moved anyone to have him rehabilitated as he did with St. Joan. Surely, the fundamental reason for this is how each of them approached those in authority over them. Now, last time we spoke from this pulpit about how Christ, the King of Kings with authority, full authority of heaven and earth, he teaches, he commands, and he calls. We save the discussion for his calls and his commands for today. Recall last time how we discovered that authority, like everything else in our holy Catholic faith, comes in the shape of a cross. Comes in the shape of a cross, the vertical of the cross. That's God made the universe such that his power or authority is transmitted to us from heaven to earth through a hierarchy. We've got a little hint of that in the gospel where the Lord miraculously divided the loaves and he gave them to his disciples and they gave them to the people. A little hierarchy hinted there. Vertical hierarchy from heaven to earth, there is a chain of command. Horizontal element in the shape of authority, as being in the shape of a cross. The church exists in a continuity that is apostolic. She does not belong to any one man or any one time. All that she teaches with God's authority must be traceable to Christ and his apostles. It must have a pedigree. It must have a genealogy. It must have a tradition. Now recall how in the matter of teaching, one must have both the vertical and the horizontal to make it authoritative. Take the death penalty as an example. There is a long tradition of the fittingness of the death penalty as a way to expiate sin and make reparation for crimes. God himself has taken the life of various sinners and commanded that the lives of various criminals be taken. He mentions it in the scriptures multiple times. This is the horizontal. It's been around for a long time. Thus, no prelate of any position whatsoever, at any time, can rightly condemn the use of capital punishment. It's impossible. He can condemn a particular application of capital punishment as being immoral, as the popes did in the case of St. Joan. But the practice of death penalty is not wrong in itself. If he tried to condemn the practice itself as immoral, then that authority that he used would not come from God. It would be illegitimate. To do that would be an abuse of power. It would be to have the vertical without the horizontal. And that's not the cross, and it's not Catholic, it's not from God. I don't have to obey. I don't have to assent to that teaching. That's an opinion. Apart from teaching, Christ also commands and He calls. He commands through His hierarchy, and He calls by choosing men to fill the places of that hierarchy. Or at the very least, He allows men to be chosen that will ultimately serve His mysterious plan. We know that they are called because they are approved by His church, which is the same as being approved by Him or allowed by Him. Are all of them virtuous? Are all of them good? Are all of them truthful? Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, was not. It's my understanding that he was so bad that no one in Rome offered a Mass for the repose of his soul, and that included a funeral Mass. No requiem for him. Imagine that. It's pretty serious. He's still considered a valid pontiff to this day. Christ our King, He called, He picked Judas. He was the worst prelate of all time, betraying the Son of God with a kiss. So, do some of the prelates of the church give me the creeps? Yes. Because they do creepy things. They do things that aren't virtuous, that aren't good, that aren't truthful. They kiss Jesus during the Mass daily, and then proceed and do not seem to hesitate in betraying Him in many ways throughout the day and even in that very Mass itself. But somehow these men are called to maintain their positions at this time. Now, which means that regardless of their moral standing, regardless of their virtue or lack thereof, they exercise legitimate authority. And somehow this is part of God's mysterious plan. But once again, the cross must be present in the use of this authority if it is to be from God. All those in the hierarchy are vertically established in their place, true. But they can only exercise their power within a certain sphere of activity that has been handed down to them. If they go beyond this horizontal, this sphere of activity, this jurisdiction, this tradition, then they lose the vertical as well. With no cross present, they act on their own and not from God. They do not exercise the keys of St. Peter, which is to bind and loose. They're not chained to Peter then. Oh, what a terrible judgment awaits such violations. And we don't have to obey those violations. But if we don't obey them, we have to recognize they're in a position in which they can put me off to the sideline. They can suppress me. They can even kill me, as they did Joan of Arc. But I don't have to obey their abusive power. The bishop who killed St. Joan did not act within his sphere. He was held in contempt and infamy, whereas St. Joan is loved and praised and will be honored for all eternity. One abused authority, the other submitted to authority and exercised it perfectly while the general of the army. Are we going to follow St. Joan or Savonarola in dealing with such prelates? The saints like Joan of Arc show us that obedience is the only response to authority. So let us turn now to the 19th century Spanish Carmelite mystic, Blessed Francis Palau, who suffered greatly from abuse of authority. He had a catechism on the virtues, and he has some valuable lessons on obedience for revolutionary times like our own. This is what he says. Question: what is obedience? It is a virtue adjunct to religion through which due submission is given to superiors within their jurisdiction. That's a key phrase. Within their jurisdiction. Question: is it necessary to obey God in everything? Yes. Because He is the supreme Lord and universal ruler of all creatures. In other words, God has universal jurisdiction. There's never a time nor a place we can disobey God. Question: is it necessary to obey a person constituted in dignity and authority? Yes. Question: in everything without restriction? No. This would be a disorder. In other words, using our imagery of the cross, this would be the vertical without the horizontal. Pure, raw use of power. Question: in what do we have to obey them? To each one of them in the order of their respective authority. A person as a person is not subject to anyone but to God alone, the author of creation, and within the order of his natural action he is free. As a Christian, he is subject to the prelates of the church in the territory designated by the ecclesiastical laws. So we have the Pope for the universal church, we have the bishop for the diocese, we have pastors for parishes and religious superiors for congregations, and we have confessors for the confessional. We have to obey in those various areas. He goes on. A citizen, he is subject to the civil authority in the term fixed by civil laws. As a servant, if in service to his master according to contract laws. As a religious, if he's made the profession of vows, to the prelates of the order in his jurisdiction, that the monastic rules and regulations give. As a sinner at the tribunal of penance to his confessor in everything necessary for the integrity of confession and the validity of the sacrament. Thank you, Blessed Francis. So, obedience is according to jurisdiction of legitimately established superiors. They can only command within a certain sphere that has been handed down to them. This is the horizontal. Sadly, this distinction is very important in our times when obedience has been used to destroy many good and holy things. For example, obedience has been used to make religious take off their habits. That is an abuse of power. To make priests destroy the sanctuaries of their churches. To make schools use erroneous and heretical books to teach children and converts, and so on and so on. You know many yourself. Let's go back to Blessed Francis. What qualities must we have to become perfectly obedient? If I'm going to obey, what do I need to do it, and how am I going to do it? Response. First, obedience must be blind. Blind with respect to the one who orders. Second, it must be prompt in the execution of orders. Third, it must be humble, submitting his judgment and will to that of the superiors. Fourth, it must be faithful, not frowning and opposing the order, but rather interpreting them according to the tacit, implied, or presumed will of the superior. Number fifth, voluntary, not bursting out with exterior complaints against the superior. And sixth, joyful, enjoying his glory, delight, and happiness in serving God and Lord, his King, represented in the superior. Blind with respect to the one who orders, prompt, humble, faithful, voluntary, joyful. Okay, question. If obedience must be blind, could it be that an insane lunatic, a person with unsound mind, might lead us to perdition? What if I have a creepy superior? Response. Obedience as a moral virtue resides in the heart and has no eyes. It is blind. It is not its duty to examine whether the one who orders is or is not a legitimate superior, whether he orders well, whether it is fitting to obey or not to obey. This concerns the virtue of prudence. Prudence has eyes. We've talked about that. Prudence is the eyes of the soul. It must see whether or not to obey. But all the other virtues are directed by it. They're blind and must follow its direction and its judgment. So, prudence determines whether this person is the legitimate superior, vertical, acting within his jurisdiction, horizontal, and whether it is sinful or not for me to obey. Once prudence has made a judgment, obedience blindly and voluntarily carries out what has been determined to be God's will, with promptness, with humility, with faithfulness, with joy. That's the rub of being a Catholic. I have to obey, whether I like it or not. And I don't pay attention to the one I have to obey. I have to be blind to the one I'm obeying. Because I want to see God, not the foibles of this person. Is he chained to St. Peter? Is he chained to the keys that bind and loose? Yes, then move on. In his catechism, Blessed Francis Palau takes up one last part that is very helpful in discussion of obedience. He discusses the excess and defects of obedience. Under excess, he writes, question, what vices has obedience by excess? Is it a sin to be extremely obedient? What's his response? Yes. It could be, and it is. First, when the superior orders against God and His laws, or orders evil things. So we obey God before men. Second, when the command is against the orders of superiors. So in other words, we obey God through men, but men in a hierarchy. If my pastor tells me to disobey my bishop, I obey my bishop. If my bishop tells me to disobey the Pope, I obey the Pope. If the Pope tells me to disobey God, I obey God. It's in a hierarchy. Also, when the horizontal is not present, he's acting outside of his realm. There's no obedience is required. So let's go through some examples. First, St. Louis de Montfort erected a beautiful Calvary in the Diocese of France. Maybe you know this story. The bishop ordered him to tear it down. The bishop, who had Jansenist leanings, was the legitimately established superior called by the King of Kings to take his place in the church. He commanded what was within his power, regulating the worship in his diocese. And this command was not sinful in itself. St. Louis de Montfort obeyed, and he is now a saint. This was his response. These are his words. The Lord allowed me to have it built. Now He allows it to be destroyed. Blessed be His holy name. If it depended on me, the Calvary would have stood till the end of time. But since it depends on God, may His will be done and not mine. Looking up to heaven with His hands outstretched, he said, I would prefer, O my God, to die 1,000 times than oppose your holy will. St. Juan Diego and Our Lady of Guadalupe, she commanded him to have a chapel built on Tepeyac. So he went to the bishop. She said, go to the bishop. He approached the bishop, the legitimate authority. St. Juan was denied. No. He was asked for proof. But instead of building his own chapel, Our Lady could have said, forget the bishop, build a chapel, Juan. No. She worked with the legitimate superior. She gave him the tilma, the image. And how many have been satisfied since? Millions converted. This would not have happened if he had built his own chapel without the permission of the local ordinary. The saints show us that the only proper response to legitimate authority acting within their sphere of power is obedience. In our revolutionary times, legitimate authority is very often held in contempt. It's attacked. It's contradicted. It's disregarded. And this is true for the authorities of both church and state. In many ways, this is not surprising. It flows from the very nature of revolution, which is to revolt, but also follows from all the abuse of authority and betrayal of those in authority and the utter lack of respect for tradition of those in authority. They've been abusing it. They've been disregarding their proper place. Are we surprised that no one holds them in any regard? Nevertheless, the saintly soul, the Joan of Arc, will always strive to adhere to the commands of legitimate superiors, come what may. Because they know that all legitimate authority comes from God, and that our very faith is based upon authority. Why do I believe? Because God said so. And so if I attack authority, don't expect God to help you keep from sinning. No wonder why so many hold tradition and yet can't stop sinning. Because they've disregarded authority somewhere and are treating it with contempt. The answer to the great problem of authority then is simply God alone. That's the answer. May we then see God alone as we spiritedly stamp out whatever there is within us that is not totally submissive to God, and let's radically adhere to all legitimately established authority, come what may. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.